Hey, hi, Erin. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
Oh, good. We're so happy to have you here. Just one sec, I'll close the door.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. I've passed on that invoice, so I'll follow up with our treasurer.
Nice.
So thank you so much for doing that. Now, did you want to go ahead and share your screen, your slides?
Sure.
Just because, or at what point, or do you want to wait a bit? It's really up to you.
Yeah, sure. Why
You
don't
can
we?
wait and do it a bit later if you want.
Yeah, I think that I mean, I know how to share a screen.
Yeah, and you're co-host, so you at the point you
Oh,
think's just right.
nice.
Feel free to share the screen, and I thought I might just start with a question, asking you to tell a little bit about how you came to get involved with animal law.
Yeah,
Just because I'm sure everybody who does this has probably got a really interesting story as to why it really captured their interest and attention.
great. Nice.
So,
Yep.
And there's probably some things that aren't on your website, I imagine, as well, about your journey to do
Yeah.
this work and the sort of thing. I guess, knowing about other types of laws probably really informed. I mean, people just probably don't appreciate the depth of. I mean, I imagine there are just so many areas of law that are touched on. So I
Yeah.
kind of know I have a bit of an acquaintance with this. I have some faculty members who've actually been writing a book about the history of animal law.
Oh, really?
Sort of
Who are they?
through the ages. Katie Barnett and Jeremy Gans.
Oh, okay. I don't know them, but
it'll look. The book will be. It may not actually be published till the beginning of next year. There's been so many delays on different things.
Yeah.
And that's definitely one that's experienced a delay in getting produced. But I think it's been a pretty interesting journey for them.
Cool.
And something that they've really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's always really positive.
Is my sound coming through okay?
It sounds great to me. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Sounds really nice. If you want to turn it up a fraction, you could try that.
Okay. I'm not in my normal office, so I don't really know like my space. This isn't yet. I've had to connect to external Wi-Fi and things like that. So.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's good. Good. Now I'm hoping that very soon there'll be people who arrive and I will admit them.
Do you want me to pop, I think in one of your emails, you mentioned that it might be a good idea to pop our donation link into the chat bar or something like that?
Yeah, you could do that. I don't know if you want to do that a little, you could do it. Or if you want to just go ahead in the chat right now and put the link to your website. Doesn't hurt, and then perhaps later on you could, it actually, I thought it might be really nice for you to talk a little bit about the types of people who volunteer for you and what they do, because you never know. We've got all sorts of people who are both lawyers and librarians, and they like to do interesting things.
Nice.
They like to do worthwhile things. So that would be great. So is that in the chat?
I will pop two things into the chat.
Okay.
One is just, that's our website. Hello.
Yep.
Sorry, this meeting room system. And then this is our donation link.
Okay.
Well, which is just a website.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
That's very, very handy to have. Okay. Hopefully everybody's. I'll just check with one of my colleagues to make sure she signed on. She told me she was going to. I think we have a fair bit of open plan office, which doesn't always work really well for Zoom meetings. And so I suspect my colleague has gone into one of our other rooms so that she doesn't get disturbed, because she was very excited about this.
Cool.
Okay, so I will start admitting people. Okay. So, the moment it seems like you're muted, Erin, but do you want to unmute as a co-host?
Sure, all good.
You may as well.
Yeah.
That should work. Okay. Give people just a little bit longer. I sometimes don't know, when you say things, when we say we're going to, when we announce ahead of time that we're going to record something, I think sometimes people think, oh, okay, it's all very stressful. It's Monday, it's the beginning of the week, it's this, it's that. I'll go ahead and listen to the recording later.
Yeah.
But then we do have some people on different time zones, like Rachel, who's joined us, is from Northern Territory, so she's on a slightly different time zone. Okay. Okay. It's always a bit disconcerting when you see people joining and it's taking them a little while. Okay. Okay, well, Erin, we're at shortly after 1 o'clock today, and I would just like to really welcome you and thank you for popping the link into the chat box. And thank you for making time to come and talk about your work with Animal Law Institute. And I thought we'd simply start by asking you, how did you get to have this position with Animal Law Institute? Tell us a little bit about yourself and about the work that you're so enthusiastic about.
Sure. Thank you, Carol. It's great to be here. I began working with the Animal Law Institute, or ALI as we refer to it, ALI, about 5 or 6 years ago, just as a volunteer. I was doing my Juris Doctor at the time, so I began working as a paralegal for a little while. I then professionally, after graduation, moved into some legal writing and research roles. So it became a lot more apparent that I could help ALI with a more comms-based role. So I started working on their media and external comms work, and For the last few years, I've been managing our social media communication, external comms and media work and that kind of thing as well. And then that brings me into 2021. We've received some funding to start an anti-puppy farm legal clinic, which we're running just this year due to funding. And I'm managing that with the assistance of our principal solicitor as well as our volunteer network. We'll have a chat later about our volunteers if you like, but we effectively have around 75 lawyers and paralegals who help out at different times with different projects. And some of those people are helping me with this new clinic in 2021. In terms of my background, I have a Master's of Law from Monash Uni in Human Rights Law. I was able to study a bit of animal law as part of that course, luckily. But my love of, everything animals, I suppose, predates all of this. I think I was just one of those kids that always grew up knowing that they would want to work in an animal-related field. It didn't have to be law. It just happened to be that way. So, yeah, that's kind of how I got involved with the movement. And I only contacted the Animal Law Institute out of the blue. It wasn't through some special connection or anything through industry. It was just my own research. So, yeah, that's my background.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, I know you've got some slides to share as you tell us about your work, so we're really looking forward to getting started to hear more and more about the projects and priorities of the important work you do. I'm just going to remind our participants that feel free to put your questions as they come to you in the chat box. We may possibly stop and answer some questions along the way, depending on how that fits with Erin's presentation. We'll make sure a little later on that you have the opportunity to get those questions answered. So we do look forward to hearing if there's anything that you want Erin to tell us a little more about or other questions. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Erin, to share your slides, and we'll start learning a lot more in depth about what you do.
Sure, I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm going to minimize the Zoom window. I'm working on a very small screen, so just bear with me in terms of questions. All right. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I am meeting you from today, the peoples of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to begin today's session with just an overview of our work. ALI is a non-profit CLC. We were founded in 2014 and we're dedicated to protecting animals through the legal system. Our volunteers are based all around the country and we're currently able to practice in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. I have the privilege of working across a number of our different practice areas, and every day in my role is a little bit different. So I've got these dot points here, which kind of summarises everything for you. We provide advice directly to clients. We will periodically be able to run strategic litigation. We host educational events and we do a bit of advocacy work. And of course, we now have a dedicated anti-puppy farm legal clinic in 2021. The clinic itself is funded by the Victorian government and therefore it's only open in Victoria at the moment. I'm going to provide you today with a bit of insight into all 5 areas of these kinds of practice, but the best place to start, I think, is actually with that last dot point, the anti-puppy farm legal clinic, because that's the focus of my role at the moment and it takes up most of my time. In a nutshell, our clinic is designed to help clients using the Australian consumer law against dodgy breeders, if you like. So when looking at the clinic, I think a great place to start is actually with the problem itself, puppy farming. You'll see that term used quite widely to describe intensive dog breeding facilities that don't really meet basic standards of care. including physical, social, or behavioural needs of animals. In reality, there is no legal definition, which is part of the reason why this term is used so often. It's important to remember when thinking about the idea of a puppy farm that it can be large or small, does tend to be large. These businesses are usually well outside of the public's line of sight, and they're of course characterised by poor welfare standards. Because there is no standard definition, one person who looks at a really large breeding facility, regardless of the welfare standards for the animals, might label that a puppy farm. Other people who look at the same breeding location and decide that because all of these animals have access to food and water and so on, that it's not a puppy farm, and they'd be happy to buy a dog from those kinds of places. For today's purposes, we'll of course focus on the worst offenders, being those which don't meet even the basic welfare standards and sometimes breach anti-cruelty laws as well. And this leads us nicely into the first example of some work undertaken by the RSPCA and Oscar's Law. In December 2013, a dog breeder named Jennifer Fraser in New South Wales was charged by RSPCA with 3 counts of aggravated animal cruelty and 4 charges of failing to provide vet care. Around a year later, in 2014, the RSPCA raided that property and seized over 100 dogs. This is a photo on the left there, taken in October 2014 by Deborah Tranter of Oscar's Law. She named that dog Sarah, who she found on a raid. Sarah, you can see, was very heavily pregnant at the time she died. Now, remarkably, after that 2014 raid, it was determined by the RSPCA that this particular facility at this time was complying with the relevant code of practice. That sets out the minimum standards for these breeding facilities. And they also were able to determine there was no breach of animal cruelty laws. Now, obviously, we're not privy to the RSPCA's case and the evidence available at that time, but this is a really good example of why the basic standards of care currently in place are just not good enough. We also understand through our intel that Jennifer Fraser is currently still operating. I'll next give you an example of the dog in the middle. Her name is Strawberry. She was named by whistleblowers who brought her case to the media's attention. It was a bit more recent. In September last year, RSPCA New South Wales raided 2 puppy farms at Inverell and Wagga, following again allegations of cruelty and non-compliance with this code of practice. Strawberry, she died at the Inverell property a few months earlier. She died from a lack of vet care while struggling to give birth over 4 days. The whistleblower who took those photos told the media that Strawberry has effectively rotted from the inside out. That whistleblower was able to later identify Strawberry's 2 surviving puppies advertised on Facebook about 8 weeks later through a shop called Claremont Puppies over in Perth. Now, the case again highlights the weak legislation in place because based on what we know today, no charges have been brought as of today. The property had also been raided previously in 2015. Afterwards, the local council brought several hundred charges against this breeder. They were all settled out of court with no recorded conviction against that breeder, who was then allowed to continue operating, which again led to Strawberry's death. This slide sets out a very general overview of how the law manages dogs used for breeding. I'm going to use Victoria as a case study because our clinic is limited to Victoria at the moment. I also note that there are no federal laws around puppy farming. All of the rules surrounding breeding are set at a state and territory and local government level, and they're not consistent across the jurisdictions. So very generally, you have anti-cruelty legislation in each jurisdiction. In Victoria, that is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, or POCTA. Then you have laws surrounding domestic animals. In Victoria, that's the Domestic Animals Act and their regulations. And then you have codes of practice. So in Victoria, we have the COP for the operation of breeding and rearing businesses. You also have a COP for the operation of pet shops and many, many others. The COP sets minimum standards such as vet care requirements and other rules around physical exercise, food and water and everything you need to take care of a dog in a breeding facility. But it's important to remember that the codes set very low standards of care. So for example, it is completely legal to keep an adult breeding dog in Victoria inside its cage for more than 23 hours a day. That is the legal minimum for physical exercise at the moment. Now, again, one person looking at that might say that is a puppy farm, and another person will say, well, technically it's legal, so it's fine. As you would expect, the RSPCA has powers under anti-cruelty legislation, and the government is also able to bring prosecutions, but the primary responsibility is with the RSPCA. In Victoria, some advancements have been made recently with passage of the Domestic Animals Amendment Act, which is sometimes referred to as Oscar's Law, so you might be familiar with that. But it hasn't removed this puppy farming problem completely. It definitely hasn't fixed anything. The recent changes have basically just introduced things like caps on the number of fertile female dogs that a breeder can own. But they don't, for example, prevent breeders from other states and territories shipping them into Victoria for sale. There are puppy brokers in Victoria who will hold these animals and rear them, and also they can obviously be sold online directly to the public. These new laws also don't prevent breeders in Victoria from actually using other people's dogs for breeding purposes, say under a lease. It's really interesting. This is coming through our clinic now. There are breeders in Victoria and elsewhere which are selling really cheap, relatively cheap, designer breeds like Groodles and Poodles and so on under contracts on the condition that a buyer will actually bring their family dog back to the breeder once a year to be used for breeding over and over again. Now, as we know, in cases of animal cruelty or offences under a code of practice, the RSPCA can prosecute. But when you look at smaller scale operations of breeding or cases where there's really not a lot of evidence of cruelty that could amount to a prosecution under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, then bodies like RSPCA are just not going to be able to take any action. They don't have the resources to investigate things like that at a low level, and they probably don't have the right evidence required to act. So we tend to ask ourselves at that point, well, what can we do? What can individuals do? How else can the law be used to really bother these dog breeders and frustrate them? What kind of evidence would we need? And that's where the Australian Consumer Law, or the ACL, comes in. We find that this is another way to frustrate these businesses using individual consumer power and not relying on the authorities. So our new clinic was established with that goal in mind. During COVID, you may have seen that there are more and more reports of people buying animals online, particularly during lockdown, for the sake of companionship. There was also a rise in adoptions from shelters, which was a great side effect. With that rising demand will come rising supply, and it makes really complete sense for dog breeders to churn increase their churn and produce as many more puppies as possible in as little amount of time as possible. This ultimately leads to poorer welfare outcomes for the animals involved. And sometimes illnesses in animals only become apparent after the puppy has left the breeder and after that unsuspecting buyer has to foot a bill for vet care that can be thousands of dollars, we're seeing. So people who have purchased a dog or another domestic pet, a cat or what have you, which later turns out to be sick, can seek free legal advice through our clinic regarding their options under the ACL. There's no obligations on them to do anything with that info afterwards. It's just to ensure that they know their options, and a lot of the time they do want to take legal action. To seek advice, a member of the public just submits a form on our website, which comes to me. I conduct an eligibility check. I confirm that we can provide advice. I take instructions from the client, gather evidence, and all of the relevant paperwork in relation to their pet. And then we deliver our advice verbally at a later appointment, which is a lot like a traditional clinic model. Now, the ACL is obviously completely different to anti-cruelty laws, and it considers the client through a completely different lens. The ACL provides consumer guarantees in relation to goods and services purchased within trade or commerce in Australia. Now, a lot of you will obviously know this, but goods must be of acceptable quality, fit for purpose, and match their description provided, amongst various other guarantees. The guarantees exist in addition to any contractual rights that the person might have, and they can't be excluded, restricted, or modified in a contract for the goods or services. So consumers are also potentially able to get a remedy against the supplier or the manufacturer. So a dog breeder and dog seller might be two different people in relation to the same animal. In the case of a pet, manufacturer will definitely be the breeder. Supplier might be a pet store. It might be another person like a puppy broker who sold the animal, or they could just be the same person. There are other causes of action, of course, under the ACL that we're looking at, such as misleading and deceptive conduct provisions, but we always begin with the guarantees. We think that's probably the best foundation for our clients' cases, which are run through VCAT. We also encourage clients to look at their rights under contract or potentially negligence, but the consumer guarantees are always our focus, which is why I'm focusing on that today. Now, the points on this slide show you the kinds of things that our clients have to be able to establish to make out a claim successfully. They have to show that they're a consumer under the ACL, that's fine. They need to show that the purchase was made within trade or commerce. Now, sometimes that can be difficult to establish if the breeder is not a regular breeder and is just kind of selling something one-off that might be considered a private sale potentially. Otherwise, they need to establish that the breeder breached the consumer guarantees. That is to say that the animal has suffered from an underlying condition at the time of sale, making it not of acceptable quality. And we have to be able to clearly attribute that illness to the breeder's conduct or a lack of doing something. Of course, the client also has to have suffered a reasonably foreseeable loss, such as having to pay vet care fees. Now, a key part of these claims, as you can imagine, is the evidence relating to the medical condition that the animal has suffered from, or in some cases, what killed it. We ask vets to provide our clients with formal reports, which can be tendered as expert evidence in litigation. That report has to include information not just about the disease or the ailment, but it also must provide comments about when the animal likely acquired that illness or the reasons as to why it developed. So, for example, a really strong case would be a genetic condition. We look at that evidence and then we advise the client on their prospect of success. If the client would like to pursue litigation, these cases are typically brought in VCAT. Clients obviously don't need a lawyer to go to VCAT if they want, but it does help. We do offer that service to some of our clients, or we help them run the matter as a self-represented litigant. We also help them develop their original application, all of their non-expert evidence like affidavits, all of their records and correspondence with the breeder become very important in that context. And these are some of the trends that we're seeing out of this clinic so far. A lot of this is probably what we expected. We're seeing mostly online sales. People are clearly not doing research on breeders at all. They have a very low understanding of the animal welfare issues involved, which I think is a major problem. They're not meeting the animal before purchase. A lot of the time that does have to do with COVID because a lot of this has happened within the last 12 months to the client, but it's always generally advised that you should meet the animal before buying it. They're also not inspecting the breeder's property, again, largely because of COVID. The clients are typically not keeping great records, so we do have to help them and dig through things and get everything in order. And a lot of the time we're seeing this understanding that someone who describes themselves as a registered breeder is automatically not a puppy farm, is automatically great. The reality is just not that simple, and it's very clear that the public does not understand this. And that's pretty much an overview of our puppy farm clinic. On a slightly more positive note, I'd like to provide you with an overview of some of the other non-clinic related work that the Animal Law Institute has undertaken since we began in 2014. So we provide advice to clients. We typically assist small charities on a pro bono basis to incorporate. We also help them by reviewing adoption agreements, related paperwork, things like that, with a view to protecting the organisation, strengthening them, and protecting the interests of the animals in their care. In some cases, we will also help individuals who approach us. There are many different practice areas when it comes to animal law, aside from animal or anti-cruelty laws, really. Animal law, as you can imagine, isn't a carved out standalone area of practice. Instead, it actually covers a lot of other practice areas. So just within the last, say, 6 months, I've had the opportunity to work on advices covering areas like property law, defamation law, breach of contract matters, family law, and a little bit of copyright and intellectual property law, which was really interesting. Outside of that, we do work on some strategic litigation. This is a very large coordinated effort, so there's only been a few cases that we've been able to run since 2014, but it's something we do in the background. The first dot point there is Nala's case. You'll be able to read a lot more about this on our website, but in a nutshell, in 2018, we began legal action on behalf of Nala, who's a beagle puppy who was discovered to be suffering from a really severe worm infestation that nearly caused her to pass away. So we used the ACL and successfully argued that her breeders should have to pay for her vet bills for the rest of her life, and we won over $15,000 for the client in that case. We run a couple of ACL claims. Yeah, they're pretty good. So that was why we thought that the clinic was an excellent way to build on that experience. There's another dot point there that says dolphins in captivity. In 2017, we brought legal proceedings on behalf of our client Action for Dolphins, their logo is there, against a Coffs Harbour Marine Park, which was then known as Dolphin Marine Magic. Dolphin Marine Magic was basically holding 5 dolphins. They were the last in captivity in New South Wales. Our case relied on the ACL again to argue that this park was engaging in misleading and deceptive conduct because it was describing their animals as happy and healthy amongst a variety of other things. We relied on scientific evidence of the emotional and physical needs of dolphins. We looked at the size of the park's enclosures and whether or not allowing people to ride dolphins promoted animal welfare and well-being. Now, the case was ultimately settled confidentially, so I won't go into too much, but since then, the park, which has rebranded itself as Dolphin Marine Conservation Park, has announced that it will no longer breed dolphins, which is a huge win. And pretty magically, our client, Action for Dolphins, has actually joined forces with World Animal Protection to work towards developing a sea sanctuary pen where the 5 remaining dolphins, some of which have since passed away anyway, but the remaining dolphins can live out their days outside pools because they can't survive in the wild, but they will never be released as a result. And they're actually working together to create a solution with the park itself, which I think is a really positive outcome to this. And this is an overview of some of our other kinds of work. So, education. We run the Australia and New Zealand InterVarsity Moot on Animal Law, or ANIMAL. That's run every year in September. There's plenty more info on our website about that moot, but it's the only animal law specific moot. So for any students that you know who are interested in this area, we always say that this is a great way to get started because it provides you with a good intro and you get to meet a lot of amazing people. Every year we run different events. Throughout COVID, this has been an absolute nightmare, but you know, we've previously run Animal Law Week events. Typically that would have been around May. And that's always different. We have different talks by different people and basically networking opportunities. And we do other industry engagement events as well, breakfasts and so on. We've had lots of different sponsors from lots of different big law firms to help out with those things. In terms of advocacy, we've previously written submissions to government inquiries. We've always put out public statements on different animal welfare issues, and we've got a lot of social media engagement. And then, of course, there's media engagement. We've previously done some work around the clinic and just for our organisation generally with media. So ultimately, these claims, like through our clinic, are only able to be brought by individuals who purchase animals from breeders and have bad experiences. I always get asked, what are the other non-affected people able to do around issues like puppy farming? The answer, I think, is that it takes legal and non-legal solutions. So I thought I would put down some of these high-level thoughts here. I think that you should always advocate when you see something going wrong, you suspect a dog could be sold from a puppy farm, for example, be alert, you know, speak up, learn to talk about the issues in a non-confrontational way and be a voice. I always say that people should volunteer, get involved with a rescue group if you like. The Animal Law Institute also periodically hires volunteers. So if you're interested, I would love if you would keep an eye on our website and our social media. We do advertise a lot on social. We always need donations. Our clinic is going to close in December this year without any additional funding. So I've popped our donation link in there. And of course, refer. So I always ask people to spread the word about this legal service that's offered in 2021 so that we can reach as many people as possible this year. And of course, find us on social media and support our work.
Okay. All right. Well, we have learned a lot in a very short time, Erin, about the work that you are doing, and I can see that our colleague Rachel from Northern Territory is giving you a big hand clap, and as is Gemma. So I suppose what else do you see? Are there any other new areas? You talked a little bit about trends in the slide, and obviously last year has just caused generate a lot of work when we think about this huge demand that the public has had for puppies, for company at home during COVID lockdowns and things like that, and that's sounds like that's really been a huge investment of time, and there's still work that's ongoing, given all those puppies that have come into people's lives in the last year. Is there anything else that you think is sort of emerging as where you're going to have to spend time and attention apart from puppy farms?
Yeah, I think that it's not just about the sort of classic ACL claims that we're talking about here, those I've bought something and I'm dissatisfied and I want my money back. Not just those claims. I think it's also all of the associated issues with dogs and cats. By that, I mean things like these contracts that people are entering to get a dog at a discounted rate from a breeder because they want a pretty Groodle or poodle dog or what have you. And then they're agreeing to bring these dogs back in for breeding once a year, say. They're commonly referred to as guardianship contracts. If you ever see that word it is a massive red flag. And it's happening right here in Victoria. It's not just other states with worse laws. It's crazy. I don't know how, as a dog owner, I would ever be able to bring my pet in for breeding. Like the physical problems associated with that, it's just boggles the mind. But people are definitely doing those things. And we've had a few clients come through saying that we need some assistance with a breach of contract matter. That's effectively what it is. And working out what's going to happen. In some cases, we've heard reports of these breeders taking the dog back for its yearly breeding and refusing to give the dog back to the family, saying that the client has breached maybe a part of their contract, for example. They'll make it up, they'll work out a way to do it and keep the dog. In other cases, we've heard of dogs being returned physically very unwell after the breeding process. And in one case I've heard of in New South Wales, the family got the wrong dog back, which is just bizarre to me. Yeah, so I think it's going to be a lot of those associated issues as well with dogs and cats.
Well, you know, I can really share your concern. I mean, you have to be a pretty sophisticated owner to take on the responsibility of a female dog that goes in heat, and a male dog that hasn't been neutered. You know, they often have some behaviours that may be a little more difficult to manage. So it seems that that is quite a challenge, and it's very concerning that you've heard so more about this.
Yeah.
We have a question here. One of our colleagues is wondering what your relationship is with other organisations like RSPCA. Do you work together on projects, or does your clinic try and focus on areas that they don't cover?
Yeah, that's a great question. So RSPCA has legal standing under the anti-cruelty legislation, whereas obviously we're helping people with a different stream of work. So we do tend to work separate, but we know them. We know the inspectorate in Victoria, for example. I've had plenty of stakeholder meetings over the last 6 months with every man and his dog. I think that RSPCA in general, they're doing amazing stuff. The RSPCA, I think, gets a lot of flack from the public because they say, well, RSPCA couldn't investigate my friend's dog's neighbour's thing that once happened, or RSPCA didn't do anything when I called them about this other thing. The RSPCA is extremely limited in what it can do under legislation, under funding and resourcing and everything. I know the people there, and I know people who are currently working in different RSPCAs around the country. They are amazing people, animal lovers, and they're really sorry that they can't help with everything. They have an extreme rate of burnout. For example, you'll get like a new report come in of cruelty, like a very immediate alert, and it looks like a genuine report. So you've got to send an inspector out that day. That'll come in at 5 o'clock on a Friday, and they'll go and do it because they'll just have to do it. They just keep working constantly. So they're under this incredible pressure from the public and also from themselves because they care so deeply about these issues that they have this terrible rate of burnout in that sort of space, and they're dealing with pretty horrific things as well. So the RSPCA's work can sometimes inform our work as well. In one case I've got, the RSPCA in Victoria is also bringing criminal charges against a breeder that we're going after through the ACL. So it can be a combined effort. And if your client is involved with the RSPCA, providing them with evidence and so on, and they provide permission to share information, then we can do that, yes. But in general, we're working on very different areas. They're dealing with the horrific stuff and we're dealing with the contracts and so on.
Okay. Our colleague Greg asks, how big is the problem, Erin? How many puppy farms do you estimate there are in Victoria?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a pretty common one. the reality is that because these issues are not, there's really only so many ways that you can find out about a puppy farm. People are not exactly willing to publicise things like this. Animals Australia estimates, I think, that it's around over 400,000 puppies being sold from puppy farms in Australia, I believe, but you can check that stat. The reality is that the statistics are just so unknown, and RSPCA also doesn't have statistics on this, and they're the ones with the real insight. I think that the main thing to think about is the consumer's power when you're buying a dog or when you're buying a cat or adopting a cat or something. You need to really criticize where that animal is coming from and just look and think at those. Say if you meet a breeder, they might be a lovely person and you go to their property and view their place. If it's really big, maybe, you know, be very critical and think internally about that sort of thing. I would label certain places a puppy farm, but another person might not do the same thing because there's no legal definition. So it's really hard to say. And I think it just comes down to a case-by-case basis of really scrutinising sources for animals.
Have you ever seen or visited a puppy farm that you felt actually, you know, was clean and well run and all those types of standards that you would really like to see above and beyond the sort of legal compliance aspects of the law? Have you ever come across such an organisation?
Yeah, I suppose that a lot of what comes to our desk is the worst kind of offenders, but they don't have to be horrific, terrible situations and explanations. They don't have to be bad per se. They can just be from a breeder who is doing the wrong thing, or who is just not checking animals with a vet before they're selling them or before they're breeding them, for example. So they'll breed animals with horrific genetic problems that you can't see until later, until they have babies. Yeah. So yeah, it's sort of a fine line. I've found being in this role, I've gone from thinking, you know, some breeders are fine, hashtag not all breeders kind of thing. And 6 months in, I'm very critical to the point where I would never pay a breeder for a dog ever again. It's I just don't think it's a wholly appropriate industry when there are a lot of animals that need homes. So that's why we would just advocate for adopt, don't shop.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Our colleague Michelle asks, any other trends of note? I hear that pet stealing was also on the increase over COVID. And what is being done? Any extra action from the police?
Yeah, I've also heard of that increasing trend in theft. It's been a big problem in the UK as well that I've seen. I have no oversight into, you know, the criminal law and what's going on in that space, but I think just keep an eye on the media and just see what happens.
Okay, thank you. Peter asks, what troubles me is that too many people define themselves animal lovers when they concentrate entirely on companion animals and have no interest in general farming issues or wild animals. So I guess that's probably more of a statement than anything else. But do you have any comments to make about what Peter's contributed?
Yeah, I agree with Peter. I think that everyone says, I love animals. And I think that the sort of tongue-in-cheek response is, well, if you love animals, don't eat them. Yeah, factory farming is a consistent problem. Again, it is behind the scenes. It's something that the public is sometimes not aware of or is willingly ignoring, perhaps. We don't work in that sort of space, but it is absolutely horrific. And I wholly agree with this sort of binary understanding where domestic animals are treated in one way under the law, but farming animals are treated in a completely different way. We have this Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which is the highest anti-cruelty legislation in Victoria, and it applies downwards over all animals. But when you have farming animals, they're carved out from those protections with other codes of practice. So anything that you, or certain things that you do to a pig or a sheep are perfectly legal, but if you did the same thing to your dog at home, it would be illegal and it would be a horrific act of cruelty. And it's a little bit hypocritical, I think, on the part of the law. And it's just out of the interests of big agriculture.
Erin, it sounds like you've had law students involved in your clinics at different times. Can you tell us a little bit about how law students have been assisting you in your work?
Yeah, I've had lots of law students volunteer as paralegals through the clinic. We do hire them in a traditional hiring model, so they are vetted and they do have to be quite, very on the ball and what you'd expect. They've tended to contact us through the moot that we run. A lot of the time that will spark a whole interest and they'll start volunteering, which has been great. Our students are an amazing resource, and our volunteers around the country.
Okay, and it sounds like they get involved in all aspects of your work at this point. So
yeah, we tend to involve volunteers. Obviously, we've got the clinic, but these other streams of work that we do, particularly with the advice-only matters, it will be kind of on an ad hoc basis. We'll just put out a call for volunteers to work on one discrete project over, say, 3 months. And we get those responses really quickly and organise a team, and then they work. So it's very ad hoc. It's very sporadic, but everyone seems to be okay with that. It's not a regular rotational thing.
Okay, I'm just going to remind everybody to keep asking questions. I'm going to ask another question. You mentioned a number of laws that you're obviously pay a lot of attention to. When you think about law reform opportunities, which aspects of some of these laws would you really like to get in there and advocate for law reform?
I think that around Australia, we all have, the law is inconsistent. So there is no federal law on anti-cruelty or puppy farming or anything that you like. I think that enshrining animal sentience in law ideally at some kind of a federal level would be a huge jump. In the ACT, for example, they have recognised animal sentience within their version of the Domestic Animals Act. I'm not sure of the name. I think it's called the Animal Welfare Act, ACT. So they say the purpose of this act is to protect animals who are sentient beings. And I think that that initial recognition is really important. We don't have that here. And there's just so many other aspects of law reform, really. You've got this whole factory farming thing, which is going to take a significant amount of work, and it will require chipping away at horrific laws that currently allow just the worst of the worst. Puppy farming is just my focus for the year, but I would like to see further amendments around the country to at least reflect the Victorian standards, which I think are still pretty low. For example, in Victoria, there are different types of breeders. So when people say, I'm a registered breeder, well, what does that mean? You can be registered with your local council and call yourself a domestic animal business, a DAB. Under the law, it means that you can own up to 10 fertile female breeding dogs. If you get approval from the Victorian Agriculture Minister, you can own up to 50 fertile female dogs on your property. Now, that doesn't include your male dogs or your puppies or anything like that. So those are the caps, and those are the best laws that we have in the country. In New South Wales, for example, there's no caps whatsoever. So these properties will have hundreds of fertile female dogs being used and bred over and over again. In Victoria, you can only legally breed a female dog 5 times. But in New South Wales, again, there's no cap, and it's just over the border. So all of those previous breeders who were operating without recourse in Victoria 10 years ago are now over the border in New South Wales. So I think bringing up everyone to the same standard across the country would be the first basic thing to do in terms of puppy farming.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we did have somebody ask about animal sentience enshrined in law, and just asking, is there precedent for that in any other common law jurisdictions?
The UK is currently, I think it's just a bill at this stage. I don't think it's passed the UK Parliament, but the UK is currently introducing a range of legislation that one of those things deals with sentience. Yes.
Okay. Have you had to look at any other common law or other jurisdictions for inspiration in how laws could be changed, how laws could be better? Have you come across anything from other jurisdictions at this point?
Look, I don't think internationally it's something that we would look at right now, because I guess this year we're focusing on this clinic. So we're just doing what we can with what we have available.
Yep.
It's not a law reform project.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's more of a hands-on reactive sort of thing that I'm working on myself.
Okay. And how many full-time staff do you currently have, Erin?
Just me.
Just you. Okay, just you and volunteers who need your time and attention to help contribute to this amazingly varied work that you do. I guess it depends on receiving more funding. What are your primary sources of funding?
We get a little bit from the public every year in donations. It's not much. It doesn't cover the rent. For the clinic itself, we've got this one-off grant from the Vic government, and that was a post-COVID thing for community legal centres. So we explained that this clinic is in response to COVID because of these, the situation. So we got this grant, and I'll just be employed until December, and then afterwards I'll wrap up my files just on my weekends. I'm going to be volunteering with ALI, the institute, for as long as it's around. It's not something that we do for money, obviously. So yeah, other than that funding, we get a little bit from the public, and that's about it at this stage. We're looking into other grant opportunities and that kind of thing, but yeah, we'll see. Okay,
well, as I think we're all a response for most of us here would be, wow, you do a lot.
Yeah.
We've really got a great sense of the what you're focusing on, and also you've pointed out there's areas where you would all love to spend more time and improve the law and improve how you or how people, educate people so that they can understand the law as it relates to purchasing a puppy from a breeder, and all those associated things. At the beginning of the chat, everybody, we did, apart from the website address, we've also got the link to the donation link, so that you can go out there if that's a charity, if this is a cause that is of interest to you. You can find out a little bit more about how you can support the work of Animal Law Institute. So it just sounds like there's an awful lot to be done, and I'm impressed that students have been interested to not only participate in the moot, which obviously helps them develop lots of skills, but that they've also been able to provide all sorts of anything from research, writing, working with clients. It sounds like they've been able to make some really valuable contributions to your work as well. So
it's been
really,
very cool.
Yeah.
We have lawyers, and I'm calling them paralegals, but they're mostly students, but some of them are already admitted lawyers. And they work across all sorts of different areas in their day jobs, or they're studying at different stages in their studies. I think most of our volunteers are in their final years of study for the students. but they're all really, yeah, they've been fantastic. And as long as they don't mind a bit of the sporadic nature of the work, then that's, yeah, they're going to do fine.
Okay. Now, obviously, we're law librarians, and lots of our colleagues, I think, are really going to enjoy listening to this recording. But are there any particular books about animal law that you've found useful, or do you have any ideas where there's some really big gaps in the literature that would be really helpful to have more information about the law and the different legal issues that you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back to my sort of favourite textbooks. There's the Deborah Cow textbook, the Alex Bruce textbook, can't even pronounce some of the others, but I've got them all.
Good.
Spent a
Okay.
lot of time in the library. I think that in terms of the gaps, it's the research gaps that are there right now. So it might be a case of, your next big PhD student will help us out. But I think that things like puppy farming, it's just so hard to collect the right research. I'd love to see literature on this, but I don't know how it would come about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying you'd just like to, if you knew a whole lot more, you had a whole lot more information that could perhaps really help you assist clients. It could probably also help you work out how to get the law changed. And on that note, have you found politicians and have people been very receptive to what you're trying to do, or have you found that that's just, it's a little tricky to find and devote enough time and attention to that sort of larger part of what your work is all about?
Yeah, overall, the Animal Law Institute hasn't done a lot of direct political engagement. I've also previously worked at a corporate communications firm, so I've got some experience in politics. We do have strong connections with the Animal Justice Party ourselves. They're in Victoria and New South Wales, as you'll know. In terms of political engagement, I think it comes from across the political spectrum. You'd be surprised. Mm-hmm. There is currently an application before a local council in New South Wales for a 300-strong puppy farm. I'm going to just call it that. If you Google this, you'll find it. And there's even a politician up there, just a local politician, who has come out against this development application and is urging the local government not to approve this new massive breeding facility. And that politician is from the Shooters Party. So they're not someone who is traditionally aligned with animal welfare things, but when it comes to puppies and dogs, people feel quite differently. Again, we're talking about that binary relationship there. So you do get lots of different support across the political spectrum. I think in Victoria, the Labor government has been pretty good. Obviously, we've had these anti-puppy farm laws passed in 2017 that were helpful and have created these caps on the number of dogs you can own now in Victoria. So there's clearly some openness and receptiveness there, but that's for today's government. Who knows what it will be like a few years from now.
Okay. All right. Well, Erin very kindly agreed to speak with us, and our organisation will be submitting a donation to Animal Law Institute, and we just wanted to acknowledge that it is your time and your talent that you've provided for us today, and we're very, very appreciative. So thank you. And we'll also look forward to being able to post the slides to our members so that they're at least seeing the slides, being a reminder of some of those laws. And I'm sure, as often happens, some of us start reading these laws and are quite concerned about gaps, and we can see how some people might not understand them and might not interpret them, let alone apply them in the appropriate manner. So we thank you and wish you well with all your good work, and we'll be announcing to our members when the recording's available. So thank you very much, Erin. And
Fantastic.
thank you to our participants who have asked good questions this afternoon. And best of luck. We'll hopefully we'll be checking your website next year, and we'll see that you're still working with Animal Law Institute, because I think we'd really like to be able to know that your work as a lawyer continues past December this year, because it sounds like there's an awful lot of work to do, and that it would be very valuable. I've just seen one last question from Peter. I see most dogs sold these days as like toy dogs. They are bred to be cute rather than to be functional, e.g. dogs that struggle to breathe if they are physically active. Is that something you address, is bad breeding practices? So I guess in just a moment, if you've got anything to say about bad breeding practices, which you have alluded to, if you've got one last comment, that would be great. And then thank you, Erin.
Yeah, Peter's referring, I think, to brachycephalic dogs, brachy dogs, with the squished faces. So pugs, French bulldogs, English bulldogs, and a variety of others. Those dogs have these conditions that are sort of as a result of ongoing long-term breeding, and they're just sort of born this way. And most of those dogs will need a surgery in their lifetime to allow them to breathe properly. So the ACL is a fantastic way to use the law against breeders of those dogs, because if one breeder slips up and says that dog is a physically active dog that you can take for runs and stuff like that, that is potentially misleading. And that is a great case for us, those brachy dogs. It's a horrific thing. Do not buy a French bulldog. Just don't do it. There are so many organisations that will help you adopt a French bulldog or a pug and all those sorts of cutesy ones if people really do want them. People are surrendering them at increasing rates because they just can't afford $5,000 to fix the dog's breathing system. And it's really sad. It's really painful for the dog. Yeah, I guess I know it's 2 o'clock, so I'll just say thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to talk to you. And I think that you guys have a really exciting little organisation. My sort of long-term goal is to work in research and that kind of thing. I love academics and I love the whole culture of it. So.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Erin, and have a great afternoon.
Awesome. You guys
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.